Alright, here we go, recording for pod25 this time, continuing Plato's Crito. Last time I sort of got a little bit off track discussing the Iliad reference that Socrates makes when he says that he doesn't think the ship is going to arrive today because of a dream, where a beautiful, graceful woman says, Socrates, you will arrive in Hyrtopia on the third day. So Crito responds to him with a strange dream, Socrates. Socrates responds, yet its meaning is quite clear, Crito, at least it seems so to me. All too clear, apparently. Look here, Socrates, it's still not too late to take my advice and save yourself. You see, if you die, I won't just suffer a single misfortune. On the contrary, not only will I lose a friend the like of whom I'll never find again, but in addition, many people who don't know you or me well will think that I didn't care about you, since I could have saved you if I'd been willing to spend the money. And indeed, what reputation could be more shameful than being thought to value money more than friends? For the majority of people won't believe it, that it was you yourself who refused to leave this place, though we were urging you to do so. So, just a couple things to chew on from this paragraph before we move on. Again, like I said last time, Crito, disciple of Socrates though he was, friend of Socrates though he was, all these sorts of things. He's basically misguided here, and he's trying to present these things as an argument in order to appeal to Socrates' way of thinking, possibly as a result of kind of the time spent with Socrates, things learned from him, making arguments, But he makes the argument, he says, many people who don't know you or me well will think I didn't care about you, could have saved you if I'd been willing to save the money. Reputation shameful, who's thought to value money more than friends. The majority of people won't believe it was you yourself who refused to leave this place. So, on the one hand, I think Socrates isn't saying that caring about, money more than friends is a good thing, but I don't think he's going to regard saving himself as really being a form of care from his friend, and therefore he doesn't want that to happen, and he's going to take some offense at this invocation of the majority and many people who didn't know you or me well, and he's going to kind of rightly make the point. Essentially, who cares about those people and their opinions? So, at least I would argue that throughout Plato's work, you can see a lot of references made by Socrates to the many, the majority, sort of these pejorative references to the majority of citizens in ancient Athens, which was a democracy of sorts, and basically anybody making an argument on the basis of what the majority thinks, what the majority believes, is not likely to satisfy somebody like Socrates. So that's something to take into account, and Socrates responds, but my dear Crito, why should we care so much about what the majority think? After all, the most decent ones who are worthy of consideration will believe that matters were handled in just the way they were in fact handled. So Socrates points out, why would I care what the majority think? There's more decent ones, worthier of consideration. They'll understand. And then Crito responds, but you can surely see, Socrates, that one should care about the majority opinion too. The present situation itself shows clearly the majority can do not just minor harm, but the very worst things to someone who's been slandered in front of them. And then Socrates responds, I only wish, Crito, that the majority could do the very worst things. Then they might also be able to do the very best ones, and everything would be fine. But as it is, they can do neither, since they can't make someone either wise or unwise. The effects they produce are really the result of chance. So, just to chew on that paragraph and Crito's paragraph before it. So Crito is pointing out Socrates, he's arguing he should care about majority opinion. He points to the present situation as evidence for this, that the majority can do more than minor harms. And again, he's doing the misguided disciple routine of thinking he's saving Socrates from something that, again, Socrates has been quite clear he doesn't view it as an evil. So where this concern comes from, it essentially, you have, if you're Socrates, you say either, you truly don't understand what I've been saying, you're truly confused, or you believe you know better than me, essentially. And in Socrates' case, he'd always be like, well, if you know better, please educate me. But, if you don't know better, don't say that or suppose that you know better just because. And then Socrates responds, he only wishes the majority could do the very worst things, then they might be able to do the very best ones. So that's kind of an interesting version of the idea that kind of in order to be able to do great good, you have to be able to do great evil, and that's an interesting idea because, is that true? If you're talking about somebody who can do the very best and worst things, would, like, I don't think you would say, for example, in a context of thinking about the omnibenevolence of a god or something like that, that you would say, especially with a sort of Socratic or Platonic style of thinking about it, that the gods could do the very worst things. So maybe that's him saying, the majority is distinctly human phenomenon, and he only wishes they could do those worst things again, so they could do those better things. And then he repeats this sort of refrain, which is sort of the conclusion of the Meno dialogue, when he says, as it is, they can do neither, since they can't make someone either wise or unwise. The effects they produce are really the result of chance. So big ideas here, that they can't do the worst things, they can't do the best things, they can't make somebody either wise or unwise. The effects they produce are the result of chance, not the result of anything else. So Socrates says this, and then Crito says back to him, well, if you say so, Socrates, but tell me this, you're not worried about me or your other friends, are you? Fearing that if you escaped, the informers would give us trouble, that we might be forced to give up all our property, pay heavy fines, or even suffer some further penalty? If you're afraid of anything like that, dismiss it from your mind. After all, we're surely justified in running this risk to save you, or an even greater one, if need be. Now take my advice and don't refuse me. So, here again, and again, Crito's getting a little more forceful. Arguably, he gets frustrated every time Socrates responds. And again, kind of like Euthyphro, he's doing the interlocutor thing where he's basically surrendering throughout the process to whatever it is that Socrates is saying to him. And, is that problematic in some ways? Should we be suspicious if somebody says, well, whatever you say, Socrates, like, that's kind of obviously less than ideal. And so, I don't think he agrees with what Socrates just said, but then he kind of moves on. He's basically like, I hope you're not worried. You think it's basically going to cause us a bunch of complications. Number one, we don't care. Number two, we'd run that risk, or even a greater one if need be, to save you. So don't refuse me. And then Socrates says, these things do worry me, Crito, among many others. And Crito says, don't fear them. The sum of money that certain people I know will accept in order to save you and get you out of here isn't that large. Next, don't you see how cheap these informers are and how little money is needed to deal with them? My own wealth's available to you, and that, I think, should be enough. Next, even if your concern for me makes you unwilling to spend my money, there are foreign visitors here willing to spend theirs. One of them, Simius of Thebes, has even brought enough money for this very purpose, and Cebes too, and a good many others are also willing to contribute. So as I say, don't let these fears make you hesitate to save yourself, and don't let it trouble you. As you were saying in court, that if you went into exile, you wouldn't know what to do with yourself. You see, wherever else you go, there will be people to welcome you. If you want to go to Thessaly, I have friends there who will make much of you and protect you, so that no one in Thessaly will give you much trouble. To go, I guess, through some of these notes from this page, I'm trying to find where the heck note number 4 is. There's note 4 says the Sukophantai, or the individuals who prosecuted others in order to get the reward offered in Athenian law to successful prosecutors as public benefactors, or a way of blackmailing someone who would pay to avoid prosecution or for personal political gain of some other sort. I see. They're explaining the word informers, so the Sukophantai, the prosecutors. So, funny, Crito says basically those people are cheap and we can afford them. And then Socrates indicates that this worries him, and Crito wants him not to be worried. He says there's multiple people with their wealth at hand for you. I believe Simius and Cebes will be present in Pedo. So again, how historical is this? How historical isn't it? Not going to get into that, but just to flag that. And he is also pointing out, don't worry about being in exile and, Thessaly region in North Greece. So he says no one will give him trouble there. Maybe it's a slightly troublesome region. He thinks that Socrates is worried about being out somewhere that he's not familiar with. But he continues, besides Socrates, I think that what you're doing isn't just throwing your life away when you could save it and hastening the very sort of fate for yourself that your enemies would hasten and indeed have hastened in their wish to destroy you. What's more, I think you're also betraying those sons' ears by going away and deserting them when you can bring them up and educate them. So far as you're concerned, they must take their chances in life. The chance they'll get, in all likelihood, is just the one that orphans usually get when they lose their parents. No, either one shouldn't have children at all, or one ought to see their upbringing and education through to the end. But you seem to me to be choosing the easiest way out, whereas one should choose whatever a good and brave man would choose, particularly when one claims to have cared about virtue throughout one's life. I feel ashamed on your behalf and behalf of myself and your friends. I fear that it's going to seem this whole business of yours has been handled with a certain cowardice on our part. The case was brought to court when it needn't have been brought. Then there was the actual conduct of the trial, and now to crown it all, this absurd finale to the affair. It's going to seem that we let the opportunity slip because of some vice, such as cowardice on our part, since we didn't save you, nor did you save yourself, although it was quite possible had we been of even the slightest use. See to it, then, Socrates, that this doesn't turn out badly, and a shameful thing for both you and for us. Come, deliberate, or rather at this hour, it's not a matter of deliberating, but of having deliberated already, and only one decision remains. You see, everything must be done this coming night, and if we delay, it will no longer be possible for all these reasons, Socrates. Please take my advice and don't refuse me. So, Crito says this, we're going to chew on those paragraphs a little bit, but just to give Socrates' response really quickly, because it's funny, he says, my dear Crito, your enthusiasm is most valuable provided it's of the right sort, but if it isn't, the greater it is, the more difficult it will be to deal with. So not to continue on Socrates' chapter, because I want to keep going through these paragraphs right here. So he points out, he says, throwing away your life when you can save it isn't just. He points out, which is probably one of his best points, that he's essentially doing harm to his children by deserting them as far as their upbringing and education are concerned. Not that his friends won't take care of them, but it's not even veto yet. He hasn't even bothered to allegedly secure those sorts of things. And so Crito makes sort of a very interesting argument, a lot of intuitive force behind it. Either one shouldn't have children at all, or one ought to see their upbringing and education through to the end. Points out how rough he's going to make it on his kids as orphans, even though Xantippe is still alive, so their mother is alive, but we don't see her mentioned a whole lot in the Platonic dialogues, so to say we know a lot about what that situation consists of would, I think, be inaccurate, but there's sort of the poignancy, too, of what Crito says in terms of talking about choosing the easiest way out, and, telling him he feels shame, and then pointing out, basically, this is our last chance if we let this opportunity slip because of cowardice on our part, and then we didn't save you, we didn't do enough, and it should have been possible, and if we were useful at all, we would have done it. And so Crito says this, but then, so to go to Socrates' response, my dear Crito, your enthusiasm is most valuable, provided it's of the right sort. If it isn't, the greater it is, the more difficult it will be to deal with. We must therefore, whether we should do what we must therefore examine whether we should do what you advise or not. You see, I'm not the sort of person who just now, for the first time, persuaded by nothing within me, except the argument that on rational reflection seems best. I've always been like that. I can now reject the arguments I stated before just because this misfortune has befallen me. On the contrary, they seem pretty much the same to me, and I respect and value the same ones as I did before, so if we have no better ones to offer in the present situation, you can be sure I won't agree with you, not even the power of the majority to threaten us as if we were children, the boogeyman of imprisonment, execution, and confiscation of property, were far greater than it is now. What, then, is the most reasonable way to examine these matters? Suppose we first take up the argument you've stated about people's opinions. Is it true or not that one should pay attention to some opinions but not others? Was it true before I had to die, whereas now it's clear that that was stated idly? For the sake of argument, it is really just childish nonsense. For my part, I'm eager to join you, Crito, in a joint examination of whether this argument will appear any differently to me now that I am here, or the same, and of whether we should dismiss it from our minds or be persuaded by it. It used to be said, I think, by people who knew what they were talking, who thought they were talking sense, who thought they were talking sense, that, as I said a moment ago, one should not take some people's opinions seriously, but not others. By the gods, Crito, don't you think that was true? You see, in all human probability, you are not going to die tomorrow, and so the present situation won't distort your judgment. Consider then, don't you think it's a sound argument that one shouldn't value all the opinions people have, but some and not others, not those of everyone, but those of some people and not of others? What do you say? Isn't that true? So, to chew on this bit, you've got Socrates saying, I don't want to be a prisoner of the moment, pro or con, so because you're not going to die tomorrow, we'll sort of rely on your opinions, and again, in sort of Socratic dialectic sense, we're going to use your opinions to try and search for some sort of knowledge that we already had before, but we just needed to recollect and rediscover. And the point he's making here, he says, enthusiasm is most valuable if it's of the right sort, but if it isn't, the greater it is, the more difficult it will be to deal with. That's sort of an interesting sort of pithy thing about enthusiasm or spirit in general. Then he says, I'm not the sort of person who's just for now, the first time, persuaded by nothing with me except the argument that on rational reflection seems best to me. So he's saying he's always been persuaded by what seems most rational to him, and and then you see later, he says, you can be sure I won't agree with you. So he's not even trying to be agreeable in this sense, and he basically mocks the power of the majority. He talks about threatening people as if children, boogeyman of imprisonment, execution, and confiscation of property. And this will go into sort of a later Platonic / Socratic opinion that essentially passing laws to proscribe certain behavior is missing the point, since the point of law is really directed towards formalizing a system of education that allows people to search for the good progressively over time. But it's just to say that he's making this argument that essentially the idea that being imprisoned or executed or having your property confiscated, that it's an evil, is really childish thinking, which I don't know if that's childish thinking or literally grown-up thinking of understanding the consequences of things. But Socrates is relying on this opinion of some people are worth our respect and some people are not, and then he's going to proceed with this to basically argue, well, even if some of the majority is worth listening to, it's probably not the whole thing as a whole. So he says that Crito goes along with him. It is, and we should value good opinions, not bad ones, yes, and the good ones are those of wise people, and the bad ones those of unwise people, of course. How then with such questions, what of such questions as this? When a man is primarily engaged in physical training, does he pay attention to the praise or blame or opinion of every man, or only to those of the man who's a doctor or trainer? Only those of the one man. Then he should fear the blame and welcome the praise of that one man, but not those of the majority of people, clearly. So, his actions and exercises, his eating and drinking, should be guided by the opinion of that one man, the knowledgeable and understanding supervisor, rather than on that of all the rest. That's right. Well then, if he disobeys that one man, sets no value on his opinion or praises, or values those of the majority of people who have no understanding, won't something bad happen to him? Of course. And what is this bad effect? When does it occur? In what part of the one who disobeys? Clearly it's in his body, that's what it destroys. That's right. And isn't the same and true in other cases, Crito? No need to go through them all, but in particular in cases of just and unjust things, shameful, fine ones, good and bad ones, cases of what we're now deliberating about, is it the opinion of the authority that we should follow in fear, or is it the opinion of the one man, if there is one, who understands these things, we should respect and fear above all others, on the grounds that if we don't follow it, we shall seriously damage and maim that part of us, which, as we used to say, is made better by what's just than is destroyed by what's unjust, or is there no truth in that? So, yeah, I'm going to pause here because he's making sort of an interesting argument, and I'll want to chew on that some more. And I think we've done a good amount of material here because I've done 1, 2, 3, like three and a half pages or so. And so we've gone through a good amount of material, and I didn't chew on a ton of it. Let's see. So Socrates starts to point to this matter of essentially you want to value good opinions, not bad ones. You want to value the opinions of essentially experts rather than just defaulting to the majority. Now, if you want to rejoinder this with any sort of statistical analysis about the majority tending closer to the truth than the individual and blah, 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 and, make your arguments. That's what philosophy is all about, is making good arguments and examining the issues sincerely. But I think, we've got here Socrates starting to just sort of make a simple designation. We don't have to go too far with it, but he's starting to point out, there's appeals to authority, and essentially the appeal to the majority is not one of them. the majority is not a legitimate source of moral reasoning. And that, though, creates questions, because then, from the moral perspective, what we say is that, or what we would say, is that other people, like Crito and arguably Socrates' prosecutors, and basically everybody except for him, they have these opinions that death is an evil, it's a this, it's a that. And certainly I think their perspective on Socrates' death is different from his own perspective, just in the sense that anybody's death is different perspectively from that person's point of view themselves as opposed to the people around them, who that's where you would argue that the connotation of death being associated with negativity has mostly to do with the lack of presence of somebody who was previously there that you probably enjoyed or was important to you to some extent, and therefore you miss the thing that not the thing you used to have, because describing somebody's presence as a thing is not correct, but there's something significant and substantial that is no longer present. And for Crito and for Plato and these other people, when Socrates is gone, they will still have his legacy. He will live on through his friends and all these sort of metaphors, but the bottom line is he'll be dead. And whether you truly believe in sort of the transmigration of the soul's hypothesis, you really believe that our souls go somewhere after death, and that Socrates believes this, and that this basically then you mean that it happened for Socrates. That's going a long way, but certainly he's just pointing to certain things and these principles, the principle of valuing good opinions over bad ones, good people and wise people over those of unwise people. These sort of traditions, teachings, regardless of like the historical Socrates' opinion on writing things down in general and blah 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 blah. I think you can say that Socrates, you can say that he transmitted a lot of ideas to his disciples that were carried forward, and Plato is pretty much inarguably the chief carrier forwarder of this whole thing, because he presents Socrates to us in such a vibrant way that he seems alive as you read through. And so, we didn't get through too much of Crito, and we did kind of stop right in the middle of something where I'm going to just sort of summarize it. So, also, I do need to go over this, though, that he makes this sort of argument that, again, I called it a bizarre argument last time. He makes this argument over and over again, but essentially his argument from techne or expertise, essentially, people tend to go to experts and specialists when they have questions on things. Therefore, why do we consult the majority at all? It's kind of an anti-majoritarian, anti-democratic, frankly, idea. But it's an idea that I think Socrates thought was consistent with his ideology overall, and therefore I don't think he was looking to overthrow the democracy by any stretch. But within a democracy that has freedom of speech, you should be able to criticize your democracy, especially when they've got such pretenses to high culture, and there's really no doubt of the high culture of the Athenians. The only question is how substantial, authentic is it as far as, does it kind of reflect wisdom in the Platonic and Socratic sense? And you would argue that because a lot of these people, if not the majority or all of them, lack knowledge, therefore there's a lack of virtue, no matter how excellent these people seem to be. And so Socrates is trying to point out to people, so he makes this analogy about eating and drinking, and he talks about how it's going to affect the body. Therefore, essentially, if there was something that was going to, seriously damage a main part of us, which, as we used to say, is made better by what's just, but is destroyed by what's unjust. So, referring to the soul there, and he's pointing out that damage to your soul would be much worse, much more shameful, and everything than damage to your body. And so, again, we're starting to see this mind-body dichotomy, which other people like Descartes and stuff will pick up and run with, and it's very easy to pick up and run with, and then you've just got your Immanuel Kant sort of critique where it's like, look at all these people who suppose that they can have opinions on all these matters and how it's kind of allowed them to become confused and misleaded around, essentially. But anyway, Socrates basically points out our lives are worth living with a wretched, seriously damaged body, but are our lives worth living when that part of us that's made by what's just and beneficial by what's just is seriously damaged? Or do we consider it, whichever part of us it is to which justice and injustice pertain, to be inferior to the body? Certainly not. On the contrary, it's more valuable, far more. Then, my very good friend, we should not give so much thought to what the majority of people will say about us, but think instead of what the person who understands just and unjust things will say. But one man in the truth itself. So your first claim that we should give thought to the opinion of the majority about what's fine, just, good, and their opposites isn't right. But someone might say, the majority can put us to death. Crito, that's certainly clear too. It would indeed be, said Socrates. Socrates, that's right. And yet, my dear friend, the arguments we've gone through still seems the same to me at any rate as it did before. And now examine this one further to see whether we still think it still stands or not. The most important thing isn't living, but living well. Yet it still stands, and the argument that living well, living a fine life, and living justly are the same does still stand or not. It still stands. Then, in light of these arguments, we should examine whether or not it would be just for me to try and get out of here when the Athenians haven't acquitted me, and if it does seem just, we should make the attempt, and if it doesn't, we should abandon the effort. As for these other considerations you raise about loss of money and people's opinions and bringing up children, they in truth, Crito, are appropriate considerations for people who readily put one to death and would as readily bring one to life again if they could without thinking. I mean the majority of people. For us, however, the argument has made the decision. There's nothing else to be examined besides the very thing we just mentioned, whether we, both the ones who were rescued and also the rescuers themselves, will be acting justly if we pay money to those who would get me out of here and do them favors, or whether we will, in truth, be acting unjustly if we do those things. And if it appears that we will be acting unjustly in doing them, and we have no need at all to give away or to give any opposing weight to our having to die or suffer in some other way if we stay here and mind our behavior when the alternative is doing injustice. So I'm going to pause here because they're going to get into a deeper discussion here, and I said I was going to stop a page ago and then kept reading, but Socrates is talking about a life worth living. He's talking about a life that is governed by principles of living well, living a fine life, living justly. They're the same, and is wondering whether it would be just to do what Crito is suggesting. And Crito is basically saying the other considerations you raised about loss of money, people's opinions, bringing up children, would be appropriate considerations. Essentially, he makes an allusion to the Miletus matter, I think, where the Athenians voted to put a city to death and then essentially rescinded that order. So there's historical precedent for him to point to be like, yeah, and he literally says, people who readily put one to death and would as readily bring one to life again if they could without thinking, I mean the majority of people. So again, this anti-majoritarian, anti-democratic style of thinking, and again, this is probably one of the things that negatively disposed a lot of people in Athens towards him. But then again, it's kind of a matter of examine the beliefs themselves, ask yourself the question if you don't think Socrates is largely correct in his sort of depiction of the politicians, the poets, the this, that, and the others, and then if you've got your disagreements, dialectic says you're more than welcome to raise disagreements and to discuss those things. But as far as I'm concerned, I think to go back to some of the things that we've been discussing since the beginning of these Plato slow reads, I mean, we've got the Socratic irony versus the sincerity and the authenticity side of things. And we heard something he said about a minute ago where, so he, so he kind of states what could be sort of the articulation of the Socratic irony more on the less charitable side of, he's essentially a thick argument to say, because he says here, it's clear now that it was stated idly for the sake of argument and is really childish nonsense, describing the possibility of something that they said about their argument about death. And so that, stated idly for the sake of argument, childish nonsense, would essentially be a pejorative way of describing Socratic irony in the sense of if it bothered you. You would point to those things. You would say, well, you're stating things idly. You don't actually believe them, so you're stating them for rhetorical, sophisticated reasons in order to construct arguments, etc., etc., etc. It's for the sake of argument, and it's childish nonsense. So that's an important thing to note. But then Socrates is kind of pointing out, he's saying, basically, if I was doing that, he'd be much closer to the majority, but he's very far away from that. And so to sort of explain how he's farther away from it, that's why I land more on the authenticity side of that debate, because I really do believe that if you read these dialogues and you read consistently and you see the consistency of ideology to ideology and the broader sort of consistencies within the ideology, therefore the degree to which the ideology as a whole is coherent. And again, as I talked about in the Euthyphro thing, arguably the least coherent part of Plato's presentation of Socrates' ideology is with respect to religion. Just very strange the things that Socrates, as related by Plato, seemingly has such a big problem with, but we see that he makes so many allusions to the Greek myths and the Greek classics that he's clearly not rejecting it completely, but he doesn't go along with it either, and so that has to be taken into account when we're going to analyze him. So I'm going to pause there and now write down on this little index card, give myself an indication of where I'm at. And this recording here, this recording is actually pod 25, I think, so pod 26 is going to be the next writing down of a sort of thought experiment here. And then in the next page or two, when we go through this, we're gonna start to see why Crito is viewed as one of the most explicitly political philosophy Platonic dialogues, in the sense that there really is not a lot of discussion of topics of death and this, that, and the other. It's largely concerned with politics, and what Socrates will argue is essentially whether or not it was just for the Athenians to condemn me, to send me to death, etc. What's what's worse than suffering an injustice is doing an injustice to other people. And again, Socrates is not certain that he ought to do the thing that people are urging him to do and running away. And so he can't just go along with it, which, Crito is pointing out to him, we're running out of time, we need to do this now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Socrates is not with that, and arguably he's doing what in American politics we refer to by at least we formally referred to when it actually used to happen. To some degree, thank God it doesn't happen anymore, and to another extent, it's a lack of a check and powers in our legislative system. But the idea of filibustering, you could argue that Socrates is literally just filibustering. You could argue he's filibustering or to delay Crito long enough that Crito will um, essentially leave him alone and allow him to be put to death civilly and without making too much of a fuss. So I just realized that this is recording through my headphones, so arguably the sound quality of this is going to be horrendous. I'm going to be curious about that. But that should be interesting to look into when I get to editing. So thanks.